This week, the Bureau of Reclamation flagged a hard operating signal at Lake Mead. The reservoir stood near 1,044 feet, while the agency projected it could end 2026 near 1,036 feet. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. Lake Mead was only 28% full. Lake Powell was only 24% full. Total Colorado River system storage was down to 34% of capacity. And the forecast for April through July inflow into Lake Powell was only 16% of normal. That is not a bad week on a water chart. That is a river system losing reserve time. The visible number is the lake surface. The hidden number is the operating margin beneath it. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is not only that Lake Mead could approach a new record low. The deeper issue is what happens when water elevation moves close to the thresholds that support deliveries, power generation, emergency planning, farming decisions, and negotiations for the rules after 2026. This is not just a reservoir record. This is an operating margin failure. So the question is no longer simply how low Lake Mead can go. The question is, what happens when that shrinking margin reaches the farm gate, the power plant, the canal, the city, and the next drought year before the system has time to recover? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this lake is not only showing water loss, it is showing where system risk may appear first. The first strange thing on the dashboard is that nothing looks dramatic until the numbers are placed in the same room. On Monday morning, the Bureau of Reclamation's Boulder Canyon Operations Office posted its weekly hydrologic update for the Colorado River system. It was not written like an alarm. It was a table. Reservoir elevation. Change since last week. Storage. Percent full. Projected end of calendar year elevation. 7-day release. But operational warnings often arrive that way. Quietly. In rows. At Lake Mead, the official reading was 1,044.84 feet above sea level. That was down 1.19 feet from the previous week. The lake held 7.315 million acre-feet of water, only 28% full. The projected end of calendar year elevation was 1,036.83 feet. At Lake Powell, upstream, the reading was 3,526.19 feet. That was down 1.05 feet in a week. Powell held 5.614 million acre-feet, only 24% full. Its projected end-of-year elevation was 3,505.02 feet. On their own, these signals could be treated separately. Together, they describe one larger configuration. The upstream savings account is low. The downstream operating account is falling. The whole Colorado River system is carrying less reserve than it had last year. And the runoff that should have rebuilt part of that reserve has not arrived in anything close to normal form. That is why this day matters. It is not because one lake dropped a little over 1 foot in 1 week. Reservoirs rise and fall. Operators release water. Cities use water. Farms divert water. Evaporation takes its portion. One weekly move can be noise. But this 1 foot drop sits inside a broader pattern. The total Colorado River system content was listed at 19.632 million acre-feet. That is 34% of capacity. 1 year earlier, the system held 23.466 million acre-feet, or 40% of capacity. That difference is not just a number. It is lost flexibility. A reservoir system is not only built to hold water, it is built to hold time. Time for a dry spring, time for a poor snowpack, time for cities to conserve, time for farmers to adjust, time for power planners to schedule around lower hydropower output, time for negotiators to write new rules before the old ones expire. When storage falls, the system does not only lose water, it loses time. By the time Reclamation published the weekly update, a second signal was already sitting inside the June 24-month study. The National Weather Service's Colorado Basin River Forecast Center was providing runoff projections into Lake Powell. The observed unregulated inflow into Lake Powell in May was only about 18% of the 30-year average. The June forecast was even harsher, about 7% of average. The April through July inflow forecast was about 15% of average in the study, then updated in the weekly report to 16%. This is the season when the upper basin is supposed to do its most important work. Winter snowpack in the mountains should become spring and early summer runoff. Runoff should move into tributaries. Tributaries should feed the Colorado River. The river should feed Lake Powell. Powell should help regulate releases toward Lake Mead. Mead should support lower basin deliveries, Hoover Dam generation, and the operational math that keeps the system moving. But the dashboard is showing a break in that chain. The missing water is not appearing first at a kitchen tap in Phoenix or Las Vegas. It appears first as an inflow number. It appears as a smaller pulse coming off the mountains. It appears as a reservoir that does not refill as much as the calendar would normally suggest. Then it travels downstream as a projection. That is the operational story of the day. The map shows two giant reservoirs. But the system is failing at the margin between what was expected and what arrived. To understand why, imagine walking into a control room. On one screen is Lake Powell. The operator sees elevation, storage, releases from Glen Canyon Dam, and the forecasted inflow that will determine how much cushion remains at the end of the season. On another screen is Lake Mead. The operator sees Hoover Dam releases, storage, projected elevation, and the level that will shape lower basin shortage conditions. On another screen are power schedules. Hydropower is not just electricity, it is flexible electricity. It can respond quickly when demand rises or other generation changes. When reservoir elevation falls, the pressure pushing water through turbines changes. That can change how much power a dam can reliably produce. On another screen are delivery obligations. The Central Arizona Project, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Nevada's use above Hoover. Mexico, under international agreements, agricultural districts, tribes, cities, industries, and ecosystems, all connected to the same river accounting. On another screen are the rules. The 2007 Interim Guidelines, the Drought Contingency Plans, the near-term operating changes approved to get through this narrow period, and beyond that, the unresolved question of post-2026 operations. That is what makes the day abnormal. The official table is not only measuring water, it is measuring pressure on every agreement that assumes water can be moved, stored, conserved, released, and shared in a predictable operating sequence. The lake is not just going down, the room around the lake is getting louder. At first, the numbers appear to contradict each other. The Lake Mead Basin precipitation to date was listed at 110% of normal. If the local basin is wetter than normal, why is the reservoir still falling towards such a low end-of-year projection? This is the detail that changes the picture. Lake Mead is not controlled only by rain falling near Lake Mead. It is controlled by the entire river system above it. Much of the water that matters comes from mountain snow and runoff far upstream. A wet signal in one lower basin area cannot erase a weak runoff signal in the upper basin. The Colorado River is not a bathtub under one rain cloud. It is a long, engineered, legally divided system that depends heavily on where precipitation falls. When it falls, how much becomes snow, how fast it melts, how dry the soils are, and how much water is consumed by heat before it ever reaches a reservoir. That is why the dashboard can show local precipitation above normal and still show reservoir stress. A person looking only at one line could miss the larger structure. A control room cannot. The weekly update showed upper basin water year precipitation at 80% of normal. That does not sound catastrophic by itself. 80% is low, but it is not zero. Yet the runoff forecast into Lake Powell was far lower than 80%. The forecasted water year unregulated inflow was about 36% of normal in the weekly report. The April through July forecast was 16%. This gap is where the story begins to deepen. Precipitation and runoff are no longer the same thing in a warming, drying basin. Water can fall from the sky and still fail to appear where the system needs it. It can sit in snowpack for a shorter period. It can melt into dry ground. It can be pulled into vegetation. It can evaporate more aggressively under higher temperatures. It can arrive earlier than expected, or arrive in a weaker pulse than the reservoirs were built to count on. The headline number is Lake Mead, near 1,036 feet. The operational signal is that the river system is not recovering on schedule. This is not just a reservoir record. This is an operating margin failure. The most important part of the day is not one number. It is the way the numbers line up. Lake Powell is low. Lake Mead is low. Total system storage is lower than last year. The spring runoff pulse is weak. Release decisions from Powell have already been adjusted downward from earlier assumptions. Drought response operations are being used to help protect Lake Powell. Lake Mead remains in a shortage condition. And the basin is approaching the deadline for new operating rules after 2026. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. The systems being pulled in are not theoretical. They have names. The Central Arizona Project moves Colorado River water across the desert toward Phoenix, Tucson, tribal communities, farms, and industrial users. The Metropolitan Water District connects the river to Southern California's urban water network. Nevada, though using a smaller share than Arizona or California, depends heavily on Lake Mead and the Colorado River for the Las Vegas area. Mexico receives Colorado River water under treaty arrangements and shortage sharing agreements. Hoover Dam sits between the water system and the power system. When the dashboard changes, all of these systems must translate the same physical reality into different decisions. A water manager sees projected deliveries. A power scheduler sees turbine limits. A farmer sees planting risk. A city planner sees demand management. A tribal government sees infrastructure and legal uncertainty. A negotiator sees less room for delay. A family does not see the dashboard at all. They see a bill, a restriction, a field left fallow, a landscape project denied, a water rate increase, or a headline that says the lake may reach another low. But the household is the end of the chain, not the beginning. The beginning is the official signal. At first, the official signal looks clean. Reclamation reports current system conditions as of a date. The table gives one number for each reservoir. But each number is built from physical measurement, forecast assumptions, policy rules, planned releases, expected demands, and conservation programs. That is why the phrase projected end of calendar year matters. It is not a prophecy. It is a scenario based on current operating assumptions and hydrologic information. It can change if conditions change. A strong monsoon pattern, altered releases, additional conservation, emergency actions, or different runoff could shift the outcome. The forecast is not fate, but forecasts do not have to be fate to be useful. They are early warnings for systems that cannot move instantly. A city cannot redesign its water portfolio in a week. A farmer cannot rebuild an irrigation system overnight. A dam operator cannot ignore turbine conditions and hope physics will negotiate. A 7-state agreement cannot be written after the crisis has already arrived at the gate, and a reservoir cannot be refilled by press release. That is what makes the dashboard tense. It is not screaming, it is narrowing. The day becomes more abnormal when the release numbers are added. Lake Mead's 7-day release was listed at 13,600 cubic feet per second. Lake Powell's was listed at 8,500 cubic feet per second. These are not just flows. They are operating decisions moving through concrete, steel, canals, river reaches, power plants, and legal obligations. A cubic foot per second is easy to ignore because it sounds technical, but it is the river in motion. It is water passing a point every second. It is the system deciding where storage will be held and where water must go. When storage is high, those choices have more room. When storage is low, every release has a shadow. Release water too quickly, and the reservoir behind the dam falls closer to critical operating levels. Hold back too much, and downstream deliveries, ecosystems, power schedules, and treaty obligations feel the pressure. The control room is not choosing between good and bad. It is choosing between risks. That is why a reservoir approaching 1,036 feet is more than a visual story about a bathtub ring on canyon walls. The bathtub ring is the evidence people can photograph. The operating margin is the danger they cannot see from the overlook. A white mineral line on the rocks says the lake used to be higher. A shrinking margin says the system has less room to absorb the next mistake, the next dry year, the next weak snowpack, the next failed negotiation, or the next heat-driven demand spike. And the timing matters. The basin is not approaching this low point in a quiet, legal period. It is moving toward it, while the current operating framework is nearing its endpoint. Reclamation has said the existing guidelines and related agreements run through 2026, and the basin is in the process of developing the next operating rules. In normal years, negotiation can lean on stored water as a buffer. In low storage years, the buffer becomes part of the negotiation. That changes the tone. When there is plenty of water in storage, delay is easier to hide. When the reservoirs are low, delay becomes visible as risk. The day, then, is not just a day. It is a snapshot of a system transitioning from temporary crisis management to a new operating era. What makes it unsettling is that the numbers are not isolated. They are synchronized. A weak inflow forecast pushes on Powell. Powell's operation pushes on Mead. Mead's elevation pushes on shortage tiers and Hoover generation. Shortage tiers push on states, districts, farms, cities, and Mexico. The post-2026 deadline pushes on every institution, trying to decide what the river can promise next. If any one part had been moving alone, the story would be smaller, but the pieces are moving together. That is the configuration. A river system built around seasonal snowmelt is receiving a weaker runoff pulse. A reservoir system built around stored surplus is operating with diminished storage. A legal system built around negotiated sharing is facing harder physical limits. A power system connected to reservoir elevation is watching the water level fall toward more constrained generation conditions. And the public sees only the simplest number. How low will Lake Mead go? That question matters. But it is not enough. The better question is what the system loses before it hits the number everyone is waiting for. Does it lose cheap flexibility in the power grid? Does it lose planting certainty in agricultural districts? Does it lose time for cities to conserve without emergency measures? Does it lose political room for compromise? Does it lose the ability to treat the next dry year as an exception rather than a baseline? That is the real dashboard. Not one lake, not one line. A chain of margins getting thinner at the same time. And once that is visible, the next question becomes unavoidable. If 1,036 feet is the headline number, what exactly does that number mean when it leaves the chart and becomes a physical condition at the dam, the canal, the farm, and the city? To answer that, we have to take the number apart. The number everyone will repeat is 1,036 feet, but the first mistake is thinking that number belongs only to the lake. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, Lake Mead was projected in the June operating study to finish the calendar year near 1,036.83 feet above sea level, with the monthly projection dipping even lower in late autumn. On a screen that looks precise, almost sterile. 1,036 feet. A surface elevation, a measured height above sea level, but a reservoir elevation is not like the height of water in a glass on a kitchen table. It is the position of an entire artificial inland sea inside a system of dams, tunnels, intakes, turbines, canals, contracts, cities, farms, and deadlines. 1 foot is about 30.5 centimeters. 1,036 feet is roughly 316 meters above sea level. That sounds abstract until you remember what the number is measuring. It is not measuring the depth at the deepest point. It is measuring where the top of the water sits against the canyon walls and against the infrastructure built around it. When that surface falls, the whole working geometry of the system changes. Boat ramps stretch farther. Intake structures sit closer to the edge of their intended range. The white mineral ring on the rock grows taller. The shoreline retreats from places people once assumed were permanent. But those are only the visible signs. The real meaning is operational. The lake surface is the pressure line. It decides how much water sits behind Hoover Dam. It affects the hydraulic head, the weight and height of water pushing through the dam. It affects how much stored supply remains for the lower basin. It affects the shortage tiers that determine how states, districts, and users prepare for cuts. It affects the political temperature of every negotiation because every foot lost makes delay more expensive. This is why the headline number has to be handled carefully. The number is not just low water, it is time being pulled out of position. Lake Mead has been low before. In July of 2022, federal and geological records described the reservoir falling to roughly 1,041 feet, the lowest level since the lake began filling in the 1930s. That number became famous because it was visible. People could stand at overlooks and see the bathtub ring, that pale line showing where water used to be. They could see abandoned ramps. They could see exposed land that had been underwater for decades. They could understand decline because the canyon had turned it into a wall-sized ruler. But 1,036 feet would move the story into an even tighter space. It would mean the lake surface is not merely revisiting the record low zone. It is pushing below it, deeper into the narrow band where physical reservoir decline and operating risk start to overlap more directly. The difference between 1,044 feet and 1,036 feet may look small when placed against a dam that rises hundreds of feet, or a reservoir that once stored tens of millions of acre-feet. It is only about 8 feet, a little under 2.5 meters. But in a reservoir the size of Lake Mead, 8 feet is not a puddle. It is a broad sheet of water spread across canyons, coves, slopes, sediment shelves, and intake zones. It is stored volume. It is margin. It is the part of the system that lets managers absorb a dry month without panic, a weak monsoon without emergency, a poor runoff forecast without rewriting the entire operating conversation. When that layer disappears, the system does not collapse all at once. That is what makes it harder to see. It simply has less room to make mistakes. The number is not only a measure of water, it is a measure of how many options remain before the next decision becomes sharper. The Bureau of Reclamation reports Lake Mead elevation because the Colorado River system is operated by elevations as much as by volume. Elevation matters because the dam and the rules are tied to it. A household thinks of water in gallons. A farmer may think in acre-feet. A hydropower operator thinks about elevation and head. A compact negotiator thinks about annual deliveries and shortages. A city water manager thinks about allocations, storage credits, conservation targets, and demand. The same falling lake enters each of those worlds in a different language. That is why 1,036 feet cannot be treated as scenery. It is an instruction traveling through the system. At one elevation, certain shortage conditions apply. At another elevation, deeper conservation pressure appears. At still lower elevations, infrastructure concerns become more serious. The lake level becomes a switchboard. One number lights up many rooms. This is not just a reservoir record. This is an operating margin failure. To feel the scale, imagine the lake not as a blue shape on a map, but as a moving ceiling turned upside down. Every time the surface drops, the usable space above critical infrastructure shrinks. The water still looks enormous from the rim. Lake Mead does not have to look empty to be stressed. That is the strange part. A person can stand above the reservoir and see miles of water and still be looking at a system in trouble. The human eye compares the lake to a swimming pool or a bay. The operating system compares it to thresholds. The eye says, there is still water. The system asks how much water can be released, where it can be delivered, how much pressure it can produce, how much capacity remains, and what happens if next year's snowpack fails again. The eye sees a lake, the system sees a countdown, and the countdown is not measured only by the day when the reservoir would reach some dramatic dead pool number. The countdown begins much earlier, as each foot lost reduces the buffer that protects decisions from becoming emergencies. That is why record low is not the worst part. A record low is a headline. A shrinking operating margin is a condition. It can spread quietly through power prices, water rates, planting plans, legal deadlines, and emergency meetings long before the public sees a catastrophic image. The number 1036 is also abnormal because of when it appears in the seasonal calendar. The Colorado River system depends on a rhythm. Snow accumulates in the mountains during winter. Spring and early summer meltwater runs into tributaries. Lake Powell receives the upstream pulse. Releases are managed downstream. Lake Mead responds through the year as use, releases, inflows, evaporation, and policy decisions interact. A low projection near the end of the calendar year means the system did not receive enough useful recovery during the period when recovery normally matters most. It does not mean nothing fell from the sky. It means not enough water arrived where the reservoir system needed it, at the scale and timing required to rebuild storage. That distinction is essential. Weather can look active in one part of the basin while the reservoir account still weakens. A storm over the desert is not the same as a strong mountain snowpack turning into sustained runoff. A wet local signal near Lake Mead does not replace the missing inflow from the upper basin. The lake is downstream of a much larger story. 1,036 feet is the visible surface of that hidden story. It is the number left behind after snow, soil, heat, runoff, releases, evaporation, and demand have all taken their share. This is why the headline number feels simple but behaves like a system. It is one line in the report, but it contains a whole year of missed recovery. It contains a mountain snowpack that did not translate into enough river flow. It contains soils that can absorb meltwater before it reaches a channel. It contains warmer air that can increase thirst across plants and landscapes. It contains cities that still need supply during heat. It contains farms that cannot simply stop being part of the food system because a chart turns red. It contains Hoover Dam, where water elevation is not just a background detail, but a physical condition for power generation. It contains the fact that the lower basin does not live beside a natural river alone anymore. It lives beside an engineered water machine, and engineered water machines do not fail only when they break. Sometimes they fail when the assumptions underneath them become too thin. The number 1036 feet is a way of seeing that thinning. It is a line where the past design of abundance meets the present arithmetic of scarcity. That is not a slogan. It is the practical meaning of a reservoir approaching a new low, while the system around it is still expected to function. In everyday terms, think of a household bank account. The danger is not only the day the account reaches zero. The danger begins when the balance falls so low that every normal expense becomes a decision, every surprise becomes a crisis, and every delay creates a fee. Lake Mead is not a bank account, but storage behaves like financial margin. Full storage lets a dry period be managed. Low storage makes each dry period more consequential. When the lake is high, the system has room to argue, adapt, conserve, and plan. When the lake is low, the same argument takes place with the clock louder in the room. A foot of water becomes a week of flexibility. A seasonal forecast becomes a political pressure. A monthly projection becomes a warning to farms and cities. The headline is 1,036 feet. The real story is what the system can no longer postpone at that level. This is why comparisons to the past matter, but only if they are used carefully. The lake's historic low in 2022 showed how far the reservoir had moved from its old operating comfort zone. It revealed old shorelines, closed ramps, exposed geology, and public shock. But the past does not automatically predict the future. A low lake in one year does not guarantee the exact same impacts in another year because releases, conservation, hydrology, policy, and demand can all change. The evidence line matters. Still, the precedent proves something important. It proves that Lake Mead can enter ranges once treated as distant, and that when it does, the effects are not confined to the waterline. They spread outward. They affect recreation first in visible ways, then operations in less visible ways, then public confidence in ways that can be harder to repair. A reservoir record becomes a psychological marker. People start to ask whether the old map is still accurate. They ask whether the promises written around the river were built for a climate that no longer exists. They ask whether a system can keep acting normal when its largest savings account is close to a new floor, and that is where 1,036 feet becomes more than a statistic. It becomes a test of perception. Can the public understand danger before the most dramatic threshold arrives? Can policymakers act when the warning is still a projection, not a disaster image? Can water users accept that the lake does not need to be empty to be in trouble? Can power planners, farmers, cities, tribes, states, and federal officials move before the shrinking margin decides for them? The water surface is still there. Hoover Dam is still there. The canals are still there. The cities are still there. That continuity can create a dangerous comfort. Systems often look stable until the margin is gone. Then the change feels sudden, even though the numbers were visible the entire time. 1,036 feet is one of those numbers. It does not shout. It waits in the table. It turns into a line on a chart. It becomes a projection. Then it becomes a planning assumption. Then it becomes a meeting. Then it becomes a cut, a cost, a redesign, or a conflict over who absorbs the next loss. The number is not just water dropping against rock. It is the future entering the operating room before most people have noticed the door opening. And once we understand what the headline number really means, the deeper question becomes harder to avoid. If 1,036 feet is the number people can see, what is the hidden number beneath it that actually writes the damage? The hidden number is not the record. The record is what the public can understand in 1 second. Lake Mead could fall below the old low. The surface could move down another visible step. The bathtub ring could grow taller. The charts could redraw the bottom line. That is the number that travels through headlines because it has drama built into it. But the visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. According to the Bureau of Reclamation's June operating study, Lake Mead was not only projected to finish the calendar year near 1,036.83 feet. The monthly projection showed the reservoir dipping to about 1,035.31 feet in November before rebounding slightly in December. That detail matters because it changes the story from a single year-end number into a moving operating condition. The lake is not simply arriving at a low point. It is moving through a narrow band. That band is the hidden number. It is the space between where the lake is now and where the system begins to lose options. It is the difference between a reservoir that is low but still giving operators some room, and a reservoir that is low enough to make every release, every forecast, and every delayed decision more difficult. It is measured in feet, but it behaves like time. It behaves like pressure. It behaves like a warning that becomes more serious before the record itself becomes famous. This is not just a reservoir record. This is an operating margin failure. A record low tells us where the lake sits compared with the past. Operating margin tells us what the system can still do in the present. That distinction is everything. A lake can break a record and still function. A system can lose margin and begin to fail quietly without any single spectacular collapse. That is why looking only at the lowest elevation is incomplete. The public asks whether Lake Mead will hit 1,036 feet. The operators have to ask what happens at 1,040 feet, at 1,038 feet, at 1,035 feet, and at every month in between, while water still has to move through dams, canals, contracts, farms, cities, and power plants. The danger is not only how low the lake gets, it is how long the system has to operate while low. That is the hidden number most people miss. Duration, margin over time. A reservoir can survive a bad moment if recovery comes quickly. It becomes more vulnerable when the bad moment stretches across seasons, then across years, then across negotiations. Low elevation in 1 month is a condition. Low elevation repeated through an operating calendar becomes a stress test. The Bureau of Reclamation's own table shows why this matters. The lake was projected to fall from about 1,044 feet in June to around 1,040 feet in July, then below 1,039 feet in August, then near 1,037 feet in September. By October and November, the projection moved into the 1,036 and 1,035-foot range. This is not a cliff, it is a descent. A cliff scares people because the drop is sudden. A descent can be more dangerous because everyone gets used to it. Each month looks like another adjustment, another line in the study, another meeting, another conservation target, another planned release, another update from the forecasters. Then, almost without a single dramatic moment, the operating room is different. The lake is still there, the dam is still there, the canals are still there, but the cushion between ordinary operation and emergency operation is thinner. That cushion is the real story. Think of the lake surface as a roof slowly lowering over a crowded room. At first, no one has to duck. People continue talking. The machines continue running. The lights stay on. Then the roof drops another inch. Then another. The room still functions, but tall equipment has to be moved. Then workers have to change how they walk. Then the whole layout has to be redesigned around the lower ceiling. Lake Mead's falling elevation works the same way. The water does not need to vanish for the system to change behavior. It only has to fall enough that the old posture no longer fits. At Hoover Dam, the reservoir elevation affects hydraulic head, the height and pressure of water available to push through turbines. Reclamation's June study said Hoover generator capacity is adjusted as Lake Mead elevations change, based on estimated effective capacity and plant availability. That does not mean the dam stops working at 1,036 feet. It means the falling lake is already being translated into power assumptions. The lake surface becomes an input into the grid, but the grid is only one pathway. The same hidden number also moves into water deliveries. For the lower basin, Lake Mead elevation is not just scenery. It is tied to shortage conditions under operating guidelines and drought contingency rules. Those rules do not wait for the reservoir to become empty. They respond to projected elevations, thresholds, and negotiated tiers. In 2026, Reclamation said a shortage condition would govern Lake Mead operations, because the earlier 24-month study projected the lake below 1,075 feet and above 1,050 feet for January 1st. That means the official system had already entered a shortage framework, long before the 1,036-foot number became the center of attention. This is the part that is easy to miss. By the time the public sees a possible record low, institutions have already been living inside a changed operating state. The visible number is late. The hidden number arrives early. It reaches agencies first. It reaches water accounting first. It reaches power scheduling first. It reaches farmers before consumers understand why planting decisions are changing. It reaches negotiators before the public knows what the post-2026 rules will say. It reaches tribes, districts, cities, and irrigation managers through documents that look boring until the margin is gone. The headline number says the lake could reach 1,036 feet. The hidden number asks how much operating room remains above the next hard decision. That is why 1 foot matters differently here than it does in a backyard pond. In a small pond, 1 foot is a visible change. In Lake Mead, 1 foot is a wide layer spread across canyons and coves, connected to millions of acre-feet of past storage loss and to future projections. But the most important thing about a foot is not only the water it represents, it is the decision space it represents. When the reservoir is high, 1 foot can feel like noise. When the reservoir is low, 1 foot can become a warning zone. It can change the confidence around forecasts. It can force closer monitoring of infrastructure. It can sharpen disagreements about releases. It can make conservation less voluntary and more urgent. The same unit becomes heavier as the lake falls. That is the strange mathematics of scarcity. A foot near the top of a large reservoir may be absorbed by abundance. A foot near an operating threshold can alter the tone of the whole system. It is like losing $1 when you have $10,000 in the bank versus losing $1 when rent is due and only $3 remain. The unit is the same, the meaning is not. That is why the hidden number is margin, not elevation. And margin is affected by more than the lake itself. It is affected by inflow from Lake Powell. It is affected by water released from Glen Canyon Dam. It is affected by evaporation. It is affected by lower basin diversions. It is affected by conservation agreements. It is affected by the timing of storms and the weakness of snowmelt. It is affected by legal rules written for a river whose flow history is now under deep stress. This is where the record low framing becomes dangerous, if it is the only framing. A record low makes people wait for a single moment. It creates the impression that the real event happens when the line crosses the old record. But systems do not wait politely for records. They react to load. They react to duration. They react to simultaneous pressure. A reservoir can cause operational strain before it breaks a symbolic record, because the system around it is already carrying stress from multiple directions. The lake level is visible outside. The damage begins inside the operating assumptions. This is the central turn. The number most people see is where the water surface sits. The number that changes risk is how much recovery remains before the next load arrives. If runoff improves sharply, the system gains time. If demand falls through conservation, the system gains time. If releases are adjusted, the system may protect one reservoir while adding pressure elsewhere. If the next winter is weak, the system loses time again. The hidden number is not a single fixed line. It is a moving relationship between storage, forecast, demand, infrastructure, and rules. That is why it is harder to explain and more important to understand. A reservoir record is simple. An operating margin failure is layered. It begins with a weak runoff year. The National Weather Service's Colorado Basin River Forecast Center projected April through July unregulated inflow into Lake Powell at a small fraction of average. That means the upstream reservoir was not receiving the seasonal refill pulse the system normally depends on. Reclamation then reflected that weakness in its operating study. Releases, projections, storage, power generation, and shortage conditions all had to be read through that diminished inflow. The missing water does not only stay missing upstream, it travels downstream as less flexibility. It becomes a lower Lake Powell. It becomes a constrained release discussion. It becomes a lower Lake Mead. It becomes a number on the Hoover line. It becomes a shortage condition. It becomes a farmer staring at an allocation. It becomes a city asking whether conservation messaging is enough. It becomes a power planner asking how much dependable generation can be counted on when the lake is lower. This is how a hidden number reaches people, not as a headline, as a narrowing set of choices. For the first people affected, the crisis may not look like a dry faucet. It may look like a letter, a reduced allocation, a changed planting plan, a more expensive pumping schedule, a cancelled crop, a new restriction, a meeting where the same sentence keeps returning. There is less water available than the old plan assumed. That sentence is the human form of operating margin failure. It does not sound dramatic. It is, because once margin falls, every dependent system must decide whether to absorb the loss now or pass it forward. A farm can fallow a field. A city can pay for conservation. A district can search for transfers. A power system can replace hydropower with other generation. A state can argue for a different share. But none of those moves is free. The cost goes somewhere. The hidden number decides how many places still have room to absorb it. This is why the lake can be both enormous and vulnerable. The remaining water is real. The scale is still massive. The Hoover Dam system is not a toy on the edge of collapse, but the evidence does not need exaggeration. The reservoir is low. The system storage is low. The runoff forecast is weak. The operating rules are under stress. The power assumptions are being adjusted as elevation changes. The end of 2026 is approaching with new rules still required for the years after it. The warning does not need to claim disaster tomorrow. It only needs to show that the cushion is shrinking today. And once that cushion becomes the central number, Lake Mead looks different. The record is no longer the deepest part of the story. It is only the visible edge of a deeper operating problem. The real question is not whether a new low will be photographed from a lookout. The real question is how many systems will already be adjusting before the photograph is taken. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. And to understand why that hidden number is shrinking, we have to follow the mechanism upstream, into the mountains, into the snow, into the soil, and into the warmer air that can turn a winter storm into missing reservoir load. The mechanism begins far above Lake Mead, in places where the river is not yet a reservoir, not yet a canal, and not yet a political fight. It begins as snow, not just snow as scenery. Snow as storage. Snow as a slow-release system spread across mountains. Snow as the first reservoir in the Colorado River Basin before concrete ever touches the water. For much of the Colorado River system, the most important water does not begin as rain falling beside Hoover Dam. It begins in the high country of the upper basin, where winter storms build snowpack across parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. That snowpack holds water in place during the cold months. Then, as spring turns into early summer, it melts into small channels, then tributaries, then the main river. Eventually, part of that water reaches Lake Powell. From there, operations at Glen Canyon Dam help shape what moves downstream toward Lake Mead. That is the old rhythm. The new mechanism is what happens when that rhythm weakens. The name is aridification. Drought sounds temporary. It suggests a dry spell that will end when the wet years return. Aridification is different. It means the landscape itself is becoming more water-hungry as heat, dryness, soil conditions, vegetation demand, and runoff behavior shift the baseline. In a drought, the system waits for recovery. In aridification, recovery becomes harder because the same storm or the same snowpack may produce less usable water than it once did. That is the mechanism behind the missing margin. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, upper basin precipitation to date was around 80% of normal in the late June update. But the forecasted water year inflow into Lake Powell was only 36% of normal. The April through July forecast was only 16% of normal. That gap is the clue. It tells us the story is not only about how much precipitation fell, it is about how much of that precipitation became river water. That is where the hidden machinery begins. Snow falls on mountains. But snow is not guaranteed delivery. Before it reaches the river, it has to survive the air, the sun, the wind, the soil, the trees, the timing of melt, and the dryness already stored in the land. The visible number is snowpack. The hidden number is runoff efficiency. Runoff efficiency is a simple idea with huge consequences. It asks how much of the water that falls from the sky actually becomes stream flow. If a basin receives a decent amount of precipitation, but the rivers remain weak, the missing water went somewhere. It did not disappear magically. It was intercepted, evaporated, sublimated, directly from snow to vapor, absorbed by dry soils, taken up by plants, or delayed in ways that do not refill the reservoir when the system needs it. This is why 100% of normal precipitation would not automatically mean 100% of normal runoff. The river is not a pipe from the clouds. It is a landscape, and the landscape now takes a larger share. Picture the mechanism as a chain moving downhill. First, winter storms move across the high country. Some fall as snow, some as rain, and the difference matters. Snow holds water in a frozen bank. Rain runs differently. It may arrive too early, move too fast, or fail to build the mountain storage the river depends on. Warmer storms can raise the snow line, meaning more precipitation falls as rain, at elevations where snow would have stored it for later. Then comes the snow season itself. A snowpack can be shallow, patchy, dusty, or exposed. Dust on snow can darken the surface, helping it absorb more sunlight. Warm spells can start melting earlier. Wind can move snow away from where it would have lasted. Dry air can pull moisture straight out of the snowpack before it becomes liquid water. Then spring arrives. This is where the mechanism becomes most important. In the old pattern, spring melt would move water into creeks and tributaries with enough strength and timing to build a seasonal pulse. That pulse mattered because the Colorado River storage system depends on it. Lake Powell does not refill evenly all year. The April through July period is the main window when the mountain system can give back what winter stored. But if the ground below the snow is dry, the first meltwater does not rush efficiently into the river. It goes into the soil. Dry soils behave like a debt. Before water can move forward, the landscape has to refill part of what was missing. The first water goes into the ground, then more water goes into shallow soil layers. Then plants begin taking water as the growing season starts. A portion returns to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration, which is the combined process of evaporation from surfaces and transpiration from plants. That word sounds technical. The process is not. It is the landscape breathing water back into the sky. A tree does not care that Lake Mead is low. A field of shrubs does not read the Bureau of Reclamation study. A warm, dry hillside does not pause because a reservoir projection is alarming. Plants respond to sunlight, temperature, roots, soil moisture, and the need to keep themselves alive. When the atmosphere is warmer and thirstier, the demand for water rises. So the water travels into the soil, from the soil into roots, from roots into leaves, from leaves into the air, and the reservoir waits. This is the part that makes aridification so dangerous for a system built on historical averages. The old calendar assumes that a certain amount of winter precipitation will produce a certain amount of spring runoff. But if warmer conditions reduce the efficiency of that conversion, the same calendar begins to lie. It still looks familiar, snow still falls, rivers still run, reservoirs still rise and fall. Operators still publish tables, but the relationship underneath has changed. The number is not just low runoff, it is the watershed being pulled out of position. Researchers writing in Water Resources Research have described how Colorado River stream flow has declined over the last century and how warming has contributed to that decline. They also note that the upper basin generates most of the river's flow and that snowpack in the high elevation headwaters is a major contributor to annual stream flow. In other words, the place that matters most is also the place where small changes in snow, temperature, and runoff efficiency can travel downstream as large operating consequences. The mechanism begins above the headwaters. It moves through snow, then through soil, then through plants, then through tributaries, then into Lake Powell, then through release decisions, then into Lake Mead. By the time the public sees the lower lake, the system has already carried the load for months. This is why the Lake Mead number cannot be understood only at Lake Mead. Lake Mead is the downstream expression of a basin-wide process. The water missing at Hoover Dam may have been lost as a weaker snowpack months earlier, or as meltwater absorbed by dry soil, or as evapotranspiration during warm spring conditions, or as a release decision made to protect infrastructure upstream. The lake is where the mechanism becomes visible. It is not where the mechanism begins. The map shows a reservoir in Nevada and Arizona. The failure begins in the snow to runoff conversion upstream. That conversion is the heart of the story. Consider the April through July forecast. In a normal year, that window is supposed to deliver the core runoff pulse into Lake Powell. In the late June update, Reclamation reported that the forecasted April through July unregulated inflow was about 1,050,000 acre-feet, or 16% of normal. An acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre, 1 foot deep. It is roughly the annual indoor and outdoor water use of several typical households, depending on location and behavior. So when the forecast loses millions of acre-feet against average, it is not a small bookkeeping error. It is a seasonal reservoir load that did not arrive. And because the Colorado River is engineered in sequence, missing water upstream becomes pressure downstream. Lake Powell has to be protected because it is not just a lake. It is tied to Glen Canyon Dam, hydropower, Grand Canyon flows, downstream releases, environmental constraints, and the coordinated operation with Lake Mead. Reclamation has already described actions to protect the Colorado River system during the 2026 drought, including reduced releases from Lake Powell and additional water from upstream storage. Those actions may protect one weak point while shifting pressure to another. That is not failure by incompetence. That is the geometry of scarcity. When water is abundant, a system can meet many goals at once. It can store, release, generate power, serve cities, irrigate farms, support recreation, and maintain ecological flows with fewer direct collisions. When water is scarce, every goal begins to touch another goal. Protecting Lake Powell can accelerate decline at Lake Mead. Holding water for power pool can reduce downstream flexibility. Meeting deliveries can lower storage. Conserving water can impose economic costs. Delaying decisions can consume the margin that would have made later decisions easier. The mechanism is physical, but the consequences are social. It is not simply that snow becomes less water. It is that less water becomes harder choices. At the household level, the mechanism may feel distant. A family in Las Vegas does not wake up and feel snowpack efficiency in the kitchen. A farm worker in Imperial County does not see evapotranspiration written on the sky. A power customer in Arizona does not think about hydraulic head while turning on an air conditioner. But the pathway is there, from warm air into snowpack, from snowpack into weak runoff, from weak runoff into reservoir projections, from reservoir projections into operating decisions, from operating decisions into water deliveries, power planning, crop choices, conservation campaigns, and cost. This is how a climate mechanism enters daily life without announcing itself. It arrives as an administrative change, a reduced release, a new shortage tier, a lower projection, a smaller planting window, a tighter power margin, a planning meeting moved from routine to urgent. The mechanism also changes what recovery means. In the old imagination, a wet winter repairs a dry year, and sometimes it can. Wet years still matter, strong snowpacks still help, conservation still helps. Reservoir operations can still change outcomes. Nothing about this mechanism says the future is fixed. But aridification makes recovery less automatic. A wet signal has to be interpreted through heat, soil, timing, runoff efficiency, and demand. A storm is not the same as recovery. A snowpack is not the same as storage. Precipitation is not the same as usable water. That is the sentence the old system struggles to absorb. It is also why the late June dashboard felt so strange. The Lake Mead Basin precipitation line could show 110% of normal, while Lake Mead was still projected to fall. That is not a contradiction once the mechanism is visible. Lake Mead is not filled mainly by local rain over the lake. It is tied to the whole river system. And the most important missing piece was the weakened upstream runoff into Lake Powell. Local weather can be wet, while the river account remains poor. That detail matters because it separates a weather event from a water supply system. A thunderstorm can wet a road. It cannot automatically rebuild a basin. A wet month can improve a local map. It cannot erase years of depleted storage if the mountain runoff pulse does not recover. In a basin this large, the location, phase, season, and pathway of water matter as much as the total amount. The public often asks, did it rain? The system asks, did it become inflow? The answer, in 2026, was not enough. This is where the mechanism reaches infrastructure. Reservoirs were built to smooth variability. They take wet years and store part of them for dry years. But storage only works if wet years refill enough of what dry years remove. When low runoff persists, the reservoir becomes less like a savings account and more like a buffer being used repeatedly without full replacement. Eventually, the question changes from how much water is in the account to how fast the account can recover between withdrawals. That is operating margin failure in hydrologic form. The Colorado River reservoirs can still function at low levels, but function is not the same as resilience. A body can keep walking while exhausted. A power grid can keep running with less reserve. A hospital can keep treating patients while beds tighten. A reservoir system can keep delivering water while its margin shrinks. The question is not whether it is still alive. The question is how much load it can absorb before the next shock. Aridification increases that load because it acts before the water reaches the reservoir. It is upstream pressure. It is background pressure. It is the quiet force that turns a familiar snow season into an unfamiliar runoff season. And it becomes more dangerous because it does not always look dramatic. There may be no single monster storm, no single day when everything changes, no single failure that cameras can easily capture. Instead, the damage accumulates through conversion losses. A little less snow stored, a little earlier melt, a little more soil thirst, a little more plant demand, a little more evaporation, a little less runoff, a little lower Powell, a little less release flexibility, a little lower Mead. Then the number appears, 1,036 feet. By then, the mechanism has already crossed hundreds of miles. That is why the science matters. Not as an academic layer placed on top of the story, but as the only way to see the story before it reaches the dam. Without the mechanism, Lake Mead looks like a lake going down. With the mechanism, it becomes the downstream gauge of an entire basin, losing conversion efficiency. It becomes a signal that the mountain water machine is not delivering on the old terms. The danger is not only the lake surface, it is the path the missing water took before the lake ever fell. And once that path is clear, the next part becomes impossible to ignore. The mechanism does not stop at the reservoir. It continues into a person, into a decision, into a field, into a bill, into a farm gate, where the river's missing runoff becomes a choice someone has to make. The river reaches a human being before it reaches a kitchen faucet. That is the part most maps hide. On the map, Lake Mead is a blue shape behind Hoover Dam. The Colorado River is a line. The Central Arizona Project is an engineered route, moving water across the desert. The shortage tier is a phrase in a federal operating document. But somewhere in central Arizona, near a farm road, the same signal arrives in a much smaller form. A farm manager stands at a gate and looks across a field. There is no siren. There is only math. How much water will be available this season? How much will it cost? Which field gets planted? Which field waits? Which crop can survive with less certainty? Which worker gets called? Which equipment is worth repairing? Which contract can still be honored? Which risk is too large to carry? The body does not experience climate change as a graph. It experiences it as a decision made under pressure. For a farm, water is not an idea. It is timing. It is delivery. It is soil moisture on a certain week. It is whether a seed goes into the ground while the window is still open. It is whether a crop can finish its season before heat, cost, or shortage turns the plan into a loss. This is where the mechanism from the mountains becomes personal. It begins with snow that does not become enough runoff. It moves into Lake Powell as a weak inflow forecast. It moves through federal operating studies as lower reservoir projections. It moves into Lake Mead as falling elevation. It moves into shortage conditions as reduced available supply. Then it reaches a farm gate. At that gate, the word aridification is useless unless it can explain one thing: why the water that used to be planned around is no longer reliable enough to plan the same way. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, Lake Mead operations for 2026 are governed by a Level 1 shortage condition. Reclamation said that condition calls for Arizona to contribute 512,000 acre-feet, about 18% of its annual Colorado River apportionment. Nevada contributes 21,000 acre-feet, and Mexico contributes 80,000 acre-feet under the related agreements. Those are official numbers, but the human pathway is not equal across every user. The reductions do not fall like rain. They move through priority. The Central Arizona Project has said Arizona's Tier 1 reductions represent 30% of CAP's normal supply, about 18% of Arizona's Colorado River supply, and just under 8% of Arizona's total water use. It also says nearly all of those reductions in Arizona have been taken by CAP water users, with less available Colorado River water for Central Arizona agricultural users. That sentence is where the river becomes a field. A city may still receive municipal water through higher priority supplies and diversified portfolios. Tribal supplies may have different legal and operational protections. Some farms may rely on groundwater, local supplies, contracts, or other arrangements. No single farm tells the whole basin story. The evidence line matters, but the pathway is real. When a lower priority supply shrinks, the first damage is not always a dry tap. It is a changed plan. The farm manager does not wake up inside the Bureau of Reclamation table. He wakes up inside a calendar. The calendar asks what can be planted now, what should be abandoned now, what can be delayed, what can be replaced, and what debt must still be serviced even if the land produces less. This is not just a drought. This is a planting window and operating margin failure. A crop is not only a plant, it is a chain of commitments. Seed orders, fertilizer, labor, irrigation scheduling, equipment, lease payments, delivery contracts, crop insurance, fuel, electricity for pumps, market prices that may shift before harvest. If the water supply becomes uncertain, every part of that chain becomes heavier. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside the decision. Imagine a field that would normally be planted because the water schedule made sense. The soil is ready. The workers know the routine. The equipment is available. The crop has a buyer. The farmer has done this before. The whole system has memory. Then the water number changes. Not enough to make the farm vanish overnight. Enough to make the plan doubtful. Enough to ask whether planting is bravery or denial. Enough to make a field that looked productive yesterday look like a liability today. That is how a reservoir level enters a person's life. It does not arrive as 1,036 feet. It arrives as should we plant. The question is brutal because the answer has consequences either way. If the manager plants and water becomes too expensive or too limited, the field may fail. Money is lost. Labor is disrupted. Soil management changes. If the manager does not plant, income disappears before the season even begins. Workers lose hours. Suppliers lose business. A packing schedule changes. A lender sees more risk. A rural community absorbs the absence. A field left fallow can look quiet from the road. It is not quiet economically. It is a missing paycheck, a missing load, a missing repair order, a missing harvest crew, a missing meal at a local diner, a missing payment that moves through the town in ways the lake photograph cannot show. The map shows water decline. The human pathway shows income decline. And because agriculture uses water at scale, the farm gate becomes one of the first places where operating margin is converted into visible choice. This does not mean cities are untouched. It does not mean farms are the only issue. It means agriculture often has less room to hide water uncertainty because crops are tied to seasons. A household can reduce outdoor watering. A city can stretch conservation campaigns across months. A farmer has a planting window, miss it, and the year changes. This is why timing is part of the hidden number. A shortage announced too late is different from a shortage known before planting. A projection in spring is different from a projection after fields are already committed. A weak runoff signal in the upper basin can travel into a central Arizona farm before most viewers understand that Lake Mead is approaching another low. The farmer feels the forecast before the lake reaches the record. That is the strange sequence. The public waits for the photograph. The farm waits for the allocation. And the allocation waits for the system's operating margin. At the human level, the mechanism becomes a narrowing of options. The farmer can shift crops if the market and soil allow it. He can fallow acreage if the finances allow it. He can pump more groundwater if the well, law, aquifer, energy cost, and long-term plan allow it. He can participate in conservation or compensation programs if they are available and enough to cover the loss. He can sell water rights or lease water under certain arrangements if the legal structure permits it. Each option sounds simple from far away. None is simple at the gate. A lower water crop may bring lower revenue. Fallowing may protect water but reduce work. Pumping groundwater can move the stress underground, where decline may be slower to see and harder to reverse. Conservation payments may help one season, but cannot always replace a stable business model. Water transfers can solve one user's shortage while moving pressure elsewhere. Scarcity does not remove consequences. It redistributes them. That redistribution is the emotional weight of the Colorado River crisis. A reservoir number in a federal study becomes a choice no one wanted to make, and that choice enters a body. It enters as stress. It enters as lost sleep. It enters as a calculation repeated at night. It enters as a conversation with a spouse, a foreman, a lender, a son or daughter who may or may not want to inherit a farm whose water future is harder to see. The body does not experience aridification as a trend line. It experiences it as a future becoming harder to promise. For the worker, the pathway is different, but just as real. A reduced planting plan means fewer hours. Fewer hours means less income. Less income changes rent, groceries, fuel, medical care, and the ability to absorb a surprise bill. The worker may not know the elevation of Lake Mead. He may never stand beside Hoover Dam, but the missing runoff can still arrive in his week. From mountain snow into dry soil, from dry soil into weak runoff, from weak runoff into Lake Powell, from Lake Powell into Lake Mead, from Lake Mead into cap supply, from cap supply into a farm plan, from the farm plan into a paycheck. That is the human pathway. And it is not dramatic because it is instant. It is dramatic because it is ordinary. A person still drives to work, a field still has rows, the canal may still hold water. The town still moves through the morning, but somewhere inside the routine, the margin has changed. What makes this more unsettling is that the farm is not only a victim of the system, it is also part of the system. Agriculture feeds people, supports rural economies, uses large volumes of water, and carries rights, histories, investments, and political weight. Any real solution must face that complexity. It cannot simply say farms bad, cities good, or cities bad, farms good. The Colorado River does not allow that kind of easy story. The river connects everyone. That is why the farm gate is a better image than a headline. It forces the question into a real place. Who gives up water? Who pays? Who gets protected? Who has priority? Who has infrastructure? Who has legal rights? Who has flexibility? Who has none? A lake level does not answer those questions. It exposes them. At 1,036 feet, the water is not yet gone, but the argument over margin becomes harder to avoid. If the system loses more room, the question is not whether people value the river. Everyone values it. The question is whose dependence becomes negotiable first. For Central Arizona agriculture, that question has already appeared through the CAP priority system and shortage reductions. For other users, it may appear later, or through cost instead of direct cut, or through conservation rules, or through power impacts, or through infrastructure investment. The pathway will not be identical for everyone. But the pattern is the same. The lake falls, the margin shrinks. The choice moves closer to the person with the least room to absorb it. This is not just a reservoir record. This is an operating margin failure. And once the operating margin reaches a human being, the video can no longer stay on the lake. It has to move to the piece of infrastructure that translates falling water into system risk most directly. Not the whole river, not the whole dam. A smaller weak point. The pressure head behind Hoover Dam's turbines. The weak point is not the whole dam. That is the part that changes the story. Hoover Dam is one of the most recognizable pieces of infrastructure in the United States. It looks permanent because it was built to look permanent. Concrete wall, black canyon, intake towers, powerhouse, transmission lines. A reservoir so large that for generations it helped sell the idea that the modern Southwest could engineer certainty out of an uncertain river. But systems do not usually reveal their weak point through the largest object in the frame. They reveal it through a smaller component. Here, the weak point is the hydraulic head behind Hoover Dam's turbines. Hydraulic head is not complicated. It means the height and pressure of water available to push through the power plant. The higher the reservoir sits, the more gravitational force the water carries as it moves through the dam. The lower the reservoir falls, the less pressure the system has to work with. That pressure is the hidden force behind hydropower. Water enters the intake towers. It moves through large pipes called penstocks. It reaches the turbines. The moving water spins the machinery. The machinery turns generators. Electricity leaves the dam and moves into the grid, serving parts of Nevada, Arizona, and California. That is the normal sequence. Reservoir, intake, penstock, turbine, generator, grid. But when Lake Mead falls, the sequence still exists, while the force inside it changes. The water does not disappear from the power plant all at once. The lights do not simply go out because a headline says 1,036 feet. That would be too simple. The real risk is more technical and more unsettling. The machines may still be present, but not all of them can safely or efficiently operate under the same low water conditions. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, Hoover Power Plant has 17 main turbines. Historically, the plant has delivered more than 2,000 megawatts of hydropower capacity and enough average annual electricity to serve about 1.3 million people. That makes Hoover not just a monument, but an active part of the Southwest's energy system. But the machinery was not designed for every possible future lake level. That is where 1,035 feet becomes a sharper number. Reclamation reported in May 2026 that recent technical assessments showed older turbines at Hoover Dam are expected to sustain severe cavitation damage below Lake Mead elevation 1,035 feet. Cavitation is what happens when pressure changes inside flowing water, create vapor bubbles that then collapse with force. Inside a turbine, those tiny collapses can strike metal surfaces again and again. The damage is not theatrical. It is mechanical, pitting, vibration, wear. Reduced reliability, a machine being eaten by the physics of low pressure. Cavitation is a small word for a large risk. It means the weak point is not the concrete wall. It is the rotating metal inside the water pathway. The dam can stand while generation capacity falls. The reservoir can still contain water while the power plant loses flexibility. The river can still move while some turbines become too vulnerable to operate. This is why record low is not the worst part. Record low is a surface number. Cavitation risk is the number entering the machinery. The visible number is lake elevation. The hidden failure point is turbine compatibility. Reclamation's May 2026 release said updated operational data showed that at Lake Mead elevation 1,035 feet, Hoover Dam's capacity could drop from earlier estimates of 1,302 megawatts to just 382 megawatts. That is not the dam losing a little performance. That is a major reduction in the dependable capacity that power customers and grid planners can count on under those conditions. This is not just a reservoir record. This is an operating margin failure. And now, the operating margin is electrical. To understand why this matters, think about what hydropower does differently from many other power sources. It is not only energy, it is flexible energy. Operators can often adjust output quickly compared with slower generating resources. That flexibility matters when demand rises suddenly, when solar production fades in the evening, when heat pushes air conditioning demand upward, or when the grid needs support during peak hours. Hoover Dam is not just producing electrons, it is providing response. So when the lake falls and generating capacity declines, the region does not only lose water pressure, it loses a tool for balancing demand. That does not mean the Southwest instantly runs out of electricity. Power systems are larger than one dam. Utilities can buy power, dispatch other resources, import electricity, use gas plants, manage demand, and plan around lower hydropower. But every replacement has a cost, a timing issue, or a reliability question. Losing flexible hydropower during hot months can make the rest of the grid work harder. The weak point is a turbine. The consequence is system flexibility. This is how infrastructure risk spreads. A lower lake changes pressure. Lower pressure changes turbine operation. Turbine limits reduce hydropower capacity. Reduced hydropower capacity changes grid planning. Grid planning changes power costs, peak demand strategies, and reliability margins. Those costs can reach cities, irrigation districts, tribal utilities, public agencies, and households that never think about the shape of a turbine blade. The damage begins inside the machine. Then it leaves as a bill. That is why the small component matters. People often imagine infrastructure failure as collapse. A bridge falls, a dam breaks, a road washes out, a blackout covers a city. But many infrastructure failures are not collapses. They are deratings, constraints, restrictions, reduced capacity, higher maintenance, more expensive backup. A system still functions, but at a lower ceiling. That is what a turbine head problem looks like. The dam still stands. The grid still runs. But the cushion is thinner. Reclamation is not ignoring the weak point. The agency announced about $52 million for critical infrastructure, operations, and maintenance at Hoover Dam, including the replacement of up to 3 older turbines with wide-head turbines designed to operate at lower lake elevations. The agency said these turbines are expected to restore at least 160 megawatts of hydropower capacity. It also said wide-head turbines can continue operating to elevations near 950 feet without excessive damage. That detail matters because it shows adaptation is possible. The story is not that Hoover Dam is helpless. The story is that the old machine is being forced into a new operating climate, and adaptation now has to move at the speed of falling water. Replacing turbines is not like replacing a light bulb. It takes funding, procurement, engineering, scheduling, outage planning, installation, testing, and coordination with power customers. Infrastructure has a body. It cannot turn instantly. A reservoir can fall faster than a turbine fleet can be redesigned. That is the uncomfortable timing problem. The water level is moving through months. The equipment upgrade moves through years. The operating rules move through negotiation. The grid moves through planning cycles. The climate moves through a changed baseline. When those clocks do not align, margin disappears. The map shows a lake. The weak point is a calendar mismatch inside the power plant. And this weak point is especially important because Hoover Dam sits at the intersection of water and energy. If this were only a water supply story, the falling reservoir would already be serious. But the dam also transforms elevation into electricity. That means the same lost foot of water can create 2 pressures at once. Less storage for water operations, less head for hydropower. A dry year becomes an energy issue. A weak runoff forecast becomes a grid issue. A reservoir projection becomes a customer rate issue. This is system risk. Not because everything breaks together instantly, but because one physical change pulls several systems at once. The power plant also has a financial structure. Hoover Dam power revenues help support operation and maintenance. If generation declines, financial pressures can follow. Reclamation has warned that continued declines could risk the facility's long-term financial viability and place added pressure on customer rates. That sentence is easy to skim past, but it is one of the most important pieces of the weak point. Falling water does not only reduce output, it can reduce revenue for the very system that needs maintenance and upgrades. That creates a loop. Lower water reduces generation. Reduced generation can increase financial pressure. Financial pressure can make infrastructure decisions more difficult. Infrastructure stress can reduce resilience when low water returns. This does not mean the loop cannot be managed. It means the weak point is not isolated. A turbine is metal, but the risk around it is institutional. Power customers, federal agencies, utilities, and regional planners all have to translate the same physical signal into budgets and contracts. If Hoover produces less, someone has to replace that capacity or accept less flexibility. If replacement power costs more, someone pays. If turbine upgrades are needed, someone finances and schedules them. If the lake continues to fall, the upgrade schedule becomes more urgent. The weak point is not only what can break, it is what becomes expensive before it breaks. This is the kind of infrastructure stress that hides behind normal appearances. A tourist can still tour Hoover Dam. The concrete still looks massive. The turbines are not visible from the overlook. The transmission lines still stretch across the desert. The reservoir still reflects sunlight. A person may look at all of this and feel reassured. But inside the operating room, the question is different. How many units can run safely? At what elevation? At what efficiency? For how long? At what maintenance cost? With what replacement power? Under what next year forecast? That is the real condition of the system. The weak point is not the whole system. The weak point is the component where falling water becomes lost capacity. Once you see that, the 1,036-foot forecast looks different. It is close enough to the 1,035-foot turbine concern that the issue stops being abstract. The reservoir does not have to cross dead pool for hydropower stress to become real. It does not even have to stop releasing water. The turbines can become the pressure point earlier. This is a common pattern in climate-stressed infrastructure. The public waits for the final threshold. The system strains at the intermediate threshold. Dead pool gets attention because it sounds final. Minimum power pool gets attention because it sounds technical but dramatic. But Hoover's turbine issue shows that the dangerous zone can begin at a higher elevation than the public assumes. Older machinery can have limitations that are not captured by the simplest version of the map. This is why infrastructure details matter. A reservoir elevation is not one universal threshold. It depends on what component you are asking about. A boat ramp has one threshold. A water intake has another. A hydropower turbine has another. A legal shortage tier has another. A recreation marina has another. A canal delivery schedule has another. A fish and wildlife concern has another. A financial repayment structure has another. The lake falls through all of them, one by one. Not in a single disaster scene, but as a sequence of operating constraints. That sequence is the weak point story. For a household, this may feel distant until the grid is under stress during a heat wave. Then flexibility matters. During extreme heat, electricity demand can rise sharply as air conditioners run across millions of buildings. Solar power may produce strongly during the day, then fall as evening demand remains high. Hydropower can help fill gaps because it can be dispatched when needed. Less Hoover capacity means one less tool is as strong as it used to be. The heat outside pulls on the grid. The low lake weakens a flexible response. The same warming climate can pressure both sides of the equation. That is the compound risk. A hot, dry year can reduce runoff and increase power demand. It can lower reservoir storage and raise air conditioning load. It can reduce hydropower flexibility and increase the need for flexible generation. It can hit water and energy together, not as separate disasters, but as linked operating loads. This is the part of the story that should make viewers pause. The lake does not need to be empty to enter the grid. It only needs to be low enough that the old power assumptions weaken. At the human level, that can reach a person as a higher power cost, a more fragile peak demand hour, a conservation alert, or a public agency paying more for replacement energy. It can reach an irrigation district whose water and power costs are intertwined. It can reach a city that has to think about water restrictions and heat emergency planning at the same time. It can reach a tribal utility or public power customer through contracts and rates. No single outcome is guaranteed by one forecast. The evidence line matters. But the weak point is real because reclamation itself has identified it, funded turbine upgrades, and tied the need to declining Lake Mead elevations and prolonged drought. The warning does not come from speculation. It comes from the agency operating the facility. That is what makes the signal so important. When an agency built around water infrastructure says older turbines may sustain severe cavitation damage below a specific reservoir elevation, that is not a metaphor. It is a maintenance and reliability issue. When the same agency says capacity at that elevation could drop to 382 megawatts under updated operational data, that is not a social media panic line. It is an operating number. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. The weak point is a set of older turbines in a power plant whose water pressure is declining with the lake. The load is a river system losing reserve. The people depending on it are not only those who drink Colorado River water, but also those connected to the hydropower system, the grid, and the public agencies that rely on Hoover's output. And the consequence chain is visible. Falling lake, lower hydraulic head, turbine cavitation risk, reduced generating capacity, replacement power, higher cost, less grid flexibility, more pressure during heat. A small component becomes a regional signal. This is the kind of detail that changes how we look at Lake Mead. The record low is no longer the center. The center is the way lower water enters hidden machinery and forces the system to reveal what it was built to assume. Hoover Dam was built around the power of falling water. The new question is, what happens when the water still falls, but not with enough head, not with enough margin, and not on the old calendar? That question is not theoretical. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind, and to understand the warning without exaggerating it, we have to look back at the precedent. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. The year was 2022, and the evidence did not appear first as a theory. It appeared as rock. Lake Mead fell so low that the canyon began showing the public a memory the operating system had carried for years. The pale mineral ring climbed higher above the water. Boat ramps stretched into useless distance. Old shorelines became visible. The reservoir looked less like a permanent inland sea and more like a ledger, revealing withdrawals that had been hidden under blue surface. According to the United States Geological Survey's Earthshots record, Lake Mead's water level fell to about 1,041 feet in July 2022. The agency noted that the reservoir had not been that low since it began filling in the 1930s. That is the precedent. Not because 2022 proves that 2026 will unfold the same way. It does not. Hydrology changes, operations change, conservation changes, forecasts change, policy choices change. A wet winter, a different release schedule, or new agreements can alter the path. History is not a script, but history can reveal a mechanism. And in 2022, the mechanism was visible. Low runoff had already been pressuring the system. Storage had already been depleted by years of dry conditions and demand. The largest reservoirs on the river were already losing the cushion that once made shortage feel distant. Then the public saw the result in the most direct way possible. A lake that millions had treated as stable fell into a range that once seemed almost unimaginable. The record low was shocking. The more important lesson was that the system had been weakening before the record arrived. This is the same lesson returning now. A reservoir does not become vulnerable on the day it reaches a historic low. It becomes vulnerable through the years and seasons that remove its ability to recover. In 2022, the public saw the surface, but the hidden story was already upstream. In the snowpack, in the runoff, in the soil, in the heat, in the rules, and in the accumulated drawdown of storage. The visible number made the headline. The hidden number wrote the damage. One of the clearest earlier signals came in 2021. NASA's Earth Observatory described Lake Mead dropping to a record low that year, and it cited the Bureau of Reclamation's explanation that the upper basin had an exceptionally dry spring. April through July, runoff into Lake Powell totaled only about 26% of average, even though snowfall the previous winter had been near average. That sentence should stop the viewer. Near average snow. Only about 26% runoff. That is the mechanism in plain language. The mountain received something that looked closer to normal. The river received something much weaker. Between those two numbers, the watershed took its share. Dry soils, warm conditions, evaporation, vegetation demand, and timing all helped turn precipitation into less usable flow. The system did not just suffer from too little weather. It suffered from too little conversion of weather into water. The headline could have been drought. The real story was runoff failure. And once that runoff failure reached the reservoirs, the first official shortage declaration followed. Reclamation announced in August 2021 that Lake Mead was low enough to trigger a shortage condition for the lower basin in the following year. That was not a collapse. It was an operating threshold. Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico faced reductions under the river's shortage sharing rules. The river system had crossed from warning into formal response. That is why 2021 and 2022 belong in the same precedent. 1 year showed the snow to runoff disconnect. The next showed the reservoir exposure. Together, they proved that the Colorado River system can be stressed before the most dramatic image appears. First, the mountain water machine under-delivers. Then, the reservoirs absorb the deficit. Then the storage cushion thins. Then the rules activate. Then the public sees the lake fall. It looks sudden only if you begin at the photograph. It is not sudden if you begin at the snow. The current Lake Mead story echoes that sequence. Once again, the attention is on the lake elevation. Once again, the deeper issue is not simply how low the water surface appears, but how much operating margin the system has left when the surface gets there. Once again, the upstream runoff signal matters more than local impressions near the reservoir. And once again, the lake does not need to be empty for major systems to feel the pressure, but the differences are just as important as the similarities. In 2022, the public was forced to accept that Lake Mead could fall into a record low range. That psychological barrier was broken. The bathtub ring became a national image. The idea of shortage became less abstract. The Colorado River crisis moved from technical documents into public language. Now the warning is more operational. The issue is not only whether the lake can break an old low, it is whether the system can keep enough margin above thresholds that affect power generation, delivery rules, and post-2026 negotiations. Reclamation's recent technical assessment of Hoover Dam adds a sharper infrastructure layer. The agency has warned that older turbines are expected to suffer severe cavitation damage below Lake Mead elevation, 1,035 feet, and that updated operational data show capacity at that elevation could be far lower than earlier estimates. That was not the central public image in 2022. It is central now. The weak point has moved from the shoreline into the machinery. That does not mean Hoover Dam is about to fail. It does not mean the Southwest is about to go dark. It does not mean one forecast number guarantees one disaster. The warning does not need exaggeration. The precedent is powerful precisely because it is measured. What 2022 showed was exposure. What the current forecast shows is proximity to a more technical operating concern. A low reservoir can look like a landscape story. A turbine threshold turns it into an infrastructure story. A shortage tier turns it into a legal and economic story. A weak runoff forecast turns it into a climate and watershed story. The same lake becomes many warnings at once. This is not just a reservoir record. This is an operating margin failure. The 2022 precedent also teaches a second lesson. Public attention tends to arrive late. People paid attention when the images became undeniable. The exposed shorelines, the stranded infrastructure, the historic comparison, the uncomfortable sense that a giant reservoir was becoming smaller in real time. Images are powerful because they reduce complexity to one frame. But operating systems do not wait for images. Water managers had been watching the decline long before the public shock. Forecast centers had been tracking runoff. Reclamation had been issuing 24-month studies. States had been negotiating reductions. Cities and irrigation districts had been preparing for shortage. Hydropower planners had been watching reservoir elevation. The real work happened in documents, meetings, models, and conservation agreements that most people never read. That delay between operational awareness and public attention is if policy only moves when the image becomes dramatic, the margin has already been spent. The precedent says the warning should be read earlier. It should be read in the runoff forecast. It should be read in total system storage. It should be read in Lake Powell and Lake Mead together. It should be read in turbine notes, release volumes, shortage tiers, and post-2026 deadlines. It should be read before the next photograph goes viral. There is another lesson from the past. The system can improve without being solved. After 2022, wet conditions in parts of the basin and conservation actions helped change reservoir trajectories for a time. Lake Mead did not simply fall in a straight line forever. That matters. It prevents the story from becoming fatalistic. Reservoirs can rise, operations can adapt, users can conserve. Emergency agreements can buy time. Infrastructure investments can reduce risk. The system is not powerless. But temporary improvement is not the same as structural recovery. A person can catch a breath while still being sick. A reservoir can rise after a wet period while still remaining far below old norms. A system can avoid collapse while still losing margin. That is why the precedent should not be used as cheap fear. It should be used as discipline. 2022 does not tell us that every year after it must be worse. It tells us that the basin has already entered operating zones that earlier generations did not treat as normal. It tells us that low runoff can overpower near normal snow. It tells us that shortage rules can activate before taps run dry. It tells us that the public image of crisis usually comes after the operational crisis has begun. And it tells us that storage is not only water. Storage is the space where mistakes can be absorbed. In 2022, the system showed what happens when that space shrinks enough for the public to see it. In 2026, the concern is that the same shrinkage is returning, while the system is also facing a more technical infrastructure pressure and a rules deadline. The current operating framework is approaching its endpoint. Reclamation's post-2026 process is meant to decide how Lake Powell and Lake Mead will be operated for potentially decades into the future. That means low water is not only a hydrologic problem, it is negotiating in the room. Every side can point to need. Cities need reliability. Farms need water for food production and livelihoods. Tribes need recognized rights and functioning infrastructure. Mexico has treaty interests. Power customers need dependable generation. Ecosystems need flow. States need political survival. The federal government needs a framework that does not collapse at the first severe test. A fuller reservoir can soften those arguments. A lower reservoir sharpens them. That is the historical echo. 2022 showed that the old comfort zone had already been breached. The present warning suggests the next problem may not be visual shock, but operational compression. Less time, less water above thresholds, less hydropower flexibility. Less room for delayed agreement. Less ability to treat the next weak runoff year as an exception. The precedent does not say the future is doomed. It says the warning is credible. Because we have already seen this type of mechanism cross from forecast into real-world consequence. We have already seen low runoff, reduce storage. We have already seen Lake Mead enter a historic low range. We have already seen shortage conditions become official. We have already seen the public learn that a reservoir can look enormous and still be in trouble. The evidence is not a prophecy. It is a boundary marker. It tells us where speculation ends and experience begins. And experience says this: when the Colorado River system loses runoff, the damage does not stay in the mountains. It moves downstream. It enters reservoirs. It lowers operating margin. It activates rules. It exposes infrastructure. It reaches farms, power systems, cities, and negotiations. That is the real precedent. Not 1 year repeating another year. A mechanism repeating through a more crowded system. The canyon has already shown what low water looks like. The rules have already shown what shortage looks like. The turbine assessment is now showing what low head can mean inside the machinery. The next question is bigger than any single record. If the old operating assumptions were built for a river with more dependable recovery, what pattern is emerging now that recovery itself has become less reliable? The pattern is larger than the lake. But the lake is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Lake Mead is not only measuring water, it is measuring whether the old operating calendar still matches the river that now exists. That is the system pattern. For most of the 20th century, the Colorado River system was organized around an assumption that sounded reasonable at the time. Dry years would happen. Wet years would return. Reservoirs would smooth the difference. Snow would build in the mountains, melt through spring, enter the river, refill storage, and give managers enough time to balance deliveries, hydropower, agriculture, cities, and legal obligations. The system was not built because the river was easy. It was built because engineers and lawmakers believed difficulty could be managed through storage, rules, and concrete. For a long time, That belief worked well enough to build a region around it. Cities grew, farms expanded, power contracts formed, canals crossed the desert, recreation economies grew around reservoirs. Water law hardened into expectations. The river became not just a river, but a schedule. Winter snow, spring runoff, summer demand, reservoir release, annual accounting, shortage planning, then repeat. But the signal coming from Lake Mead is that the repetition is no longer reliable enough. This is not only a low reservoir, it is a calendar failure. The old calendar assumed the system would receive enough recovery, often enough to keep the margins from collapsing. The new pattern is showing recovery that can arrive late, weak, uneven, or not at the scale required. A wet signal in one place does not guarantee refill. A snowpack measurement does not guarantee runoff. A single improved year does not restore the old baseline. The system can still recover partially, but it can no longer assume recovery will arrive on schedule. That is a different world for water management. In the old world, shortage was treated as an exceptional state. In the emerging world, shortage planning becomes a permanent operating language. Conservation is not a temporary campaign after a bad year. It becomes a structural feature. Infrastructure upgrades are not optional modernization. They become part of keeping old systems usable under new conditions. Negotiation is not a political exercise that can drift. It becomes an operating necessity. This is not just a reservoir record. This is an operating margin failure. And margin is the word that connects every system. Water margin tells operators how much storage remains before deeper cuts or infrastructure risks appear. Power margin tells grid planners how much flexible hydropower remains when heat drives electricity demand. Agricultural margin tells a farmer whether a planting decision can survive uncertainty. Urban margin tells a city whether conservation can stay voluntary or must become sharper. Political margin tells negotiators how much time remains before physics removes choices from the table. The lake is low, but the larger pattern is thinner margin everywhere. This is how a reservoir becomes a system signal. A low Lake Mead does not only say the lower basin has a problem, it says the headwaters, the storage network, the legal framework, the power system, the farm economy, and the urban growth model are all connected by a smaller cushion than the old planning culture assumed. That connection matters because the Colorado River is not managed as one simple pipe. It is divided across 7 U.S. states and Mexico, across upper basin and lower basin interests, across tribes, cities, farms, environmental needs, hydropower customers, recreation economies, and federal responsibilities. According to Reclamation, the river supplies water to more than 40 million people, but the number alone does not capture the difficulty. The difficulty is that those 40 million people do not depend on the river in the same way, with the same rights, the same infrastructure, the same flexibility, or the same ability to absorb loss. A household in Las Vegas sees one kind of risk. A farm in central Arizona sees another. A tribal community with unresolved or underdeveloped water infrastructure sees another. A city in Southern California sees another. A power customer connected to Hoover generation sees another. Mexico sees another. The river connects them, but it does not make them equal. That is why the system pattern becomes political as soon as it becomes physical. When there is enough water, inequality can be hidden by abundance. When the river shrinks, priority becomes visible. Infrastructure becomes visible. Legal history becomes visible. Who has senior rights? Who has junior rights? Who has canals? Who has groundwater backup? Who has money for conservation? Who can pay for replacement power? Who can wait? Who cannot? Low water does not create every inequality. It reveals them. That is one of the most important system shifts. The problem is no longer only hydrology. It is hydrology moving through institutions built for a different baseline. The current operating rules are part of that pressure. Reclamation has said several major agreements and documents that guide Colorado River operations are scheduled to expire at the end of 2026. These include the 2007 Interim Guidelines, the 2019 Drought Contingency Plans, and international agreements with Mexico. The post-2026 process is meant to define how Lake Powell and Lake Mead will be operated for potentially decades into the future. That means Lake Mead is falling into a rules transition. This is not only a water shortage, it is a governance stress test. The timing is crucial. If the reservoirs were high, the next set of rules could be negotiated with more room for compromise. If the runoff outlook were strong, each side could imagine a softer landing. But when storage is low and forecasts are weak, every proposed rule is judged against a harder question. Who takes less, when less is not theoretical anymore? A higher reservoir allows disagreement to look procedural. A lower reservoir makes disagreement operational. That is the danger of the post-2026 deadline. It is not only that old agreements expire, it is that the new agreement must be written for a river that is already demonstrating why the old assumptions are insufficient. The negotiation is not happening outside the crisis. It is happening inside it. Reclamation released the draft environmental impact statement for post-2026 operations in January 2026, and the public review process drew more than 18,000 submissions. That tells us something important. This is not a small technical update buried in a federal archive. It is a contested future. States, tribes, federal agencies, local governments, water districts, environmental groups, agricultural users, power interests, and the public all have reasons to care, because the next framework will decide how scarcity is converted into rules. A reservoir projection becomes a legal argument. A runoff forecast becomes a political pressure. A turbine threshold becomes an infrastructure priority. A shortage tier becomes a household and farm consequence. This is the pattern. Climate stress does not stay in climate. It enters every system that assumed the climate would remain within a familiar range. That is why the phrase, new baseline, is dangerous but necessary. It is dangerous if people use it to mean nothing can be done. That is false. Conservation matters. Infrastructure matters. Rules matter. Local adaptation matters. Forecasting matters. Demand management matters. Tribal water settlements and infrastructure matter. Agricultural efficiency and economic support matter. Urban reuse and stormwater capture matter. Power planning matters. None of this is hopeless. But new baseline is necessary if it means the old average can no longer be treated as a safe planning flaw. The future will not be managed well if every dry signal is treated as a temporary detour from normal. The system must ask whether normal itself has moved. That does not mean every year will be dry. Wet years will still happen. Snow will still fall. Reservoirs can still rise. Some seasons will still surprise on the positive side. But a system cannot be built only for average conditions when the damaging pattern is created by extremes, weak recovery, and shorter margins between shocks. The old calendar asked, when will the river return to normal? The new calendar asks, what if recovery arrives too weak to rebuild the cushion before the next load? That is the future echo. A reservoir system can survive many things if it has time between them. A dry year can be managed if followed by sufficient recovery. A weak power season can be managed if the next year restores head. A planting cut can be absorbed if the next season is more predictable. A hard negotiation can succeed if the parties believe the physical system gives them time. But when the interval between loads shrinks, the system changes character. Recovery failure becomes as important as the original shock. This is what Lake Mead is showing. The crisis is not simply that the lake may touch 1,036 feet. The crisis is that the system may not have enough recovery time before the next stress arrives. Another weak snowpack, another hot spring, another high-demand summer, another wildfire season affecting watersheds, another power peak, another legal deadline, another year when conservation has to do more than it did before. The danger is not only one low point, it is low points arriving before the system has rebuilt. That pattern can shift risk across seasons. Spring becomes more important because runoff efficiency decides whether reservoirs recover. Summer becomes more dangerous because heat raises water demand and electricity demand at the same time. Autumn becomes tense because reservoir projections move toward year-end operating decisions. Winter becomes strategic because snowpack is no longer just winter weather. It is next year's margin forming in the mountains. The calendar is no longer background. The calendar is infrastructure. Risk can also shift across regions. The upper basin may feel pressure through snowpack, runoff, upstream reservoirs, compact obligations, ecosystems, and local water supplies. The lower basin may feel pressure through Lake Mead elevation, shortage tiers, canal deliveries, agriculture, urban conservation, and Hoover generation. Mexico faces treaty-related reductions and shared scarcity. Tribal nations face both legal water rights questions and the physical reality of whether infrastructure exists to use those rights. Power customers face the changing value and reliability of hydropower. Recreation communities face the exposed shoreline and access problems that come with lower reservoirs. One river, many failure modes. That is why a single lake level cannot capture the system pattern by itself. 1,036 feet is a headline number. The system pattern is what that number touches, and what it touches keeps expanding. It touches energy because hydropower depends on reservoir elevation. It touches food because irrigation depends on delivery reliability. It touches cities because urban growth assumed water planning would stay manageable. It touches public finance because replacement water, conservation programs, infrastructure upgrades, and replacement power cost money. It touches law because the next operating rules must define scarcity before scarcity defines the rules. It touches trust because people can accept difficult measures more easily when they believe the burden is fair and the evidence is honest. Trust may be the most underestimated infrastructure in the basin. Concrete matters, turbines matter, canals matter, but trust decides whether conservation agreements hold, whether states compromise, whether communities believe official projections, and whether people act before the crisis becomes visible from the overlook. A river system cannot be operated only by equations. It must also be operated through legitimacy. When the lake falls, trust is tested. If one group believes another is protected unfairly, cooperation weakens. If cities think agriculture is not doing enough, conflict rises. If farms think cities are insulated from sacrifice, conflict rises. If tribes are treated as afterthoughts, legitimacy fails. If Mexico is not treated as part of the system, the map becomes politically false. If the public hears only optimism until emergency arrives, trust breaks. The warning is not just hydrologic, it is social. This is why the response can become overloaded. Water managers are not only managing water, they are managing demand, power coordination, legal deadlines, emergency drought response, infrastructure upgrades, public communication, tribal engagement, binational coordination, environmental constraints, and economic consequences. Each piece has its own timeline. Each piece has its own stakeholders. Each piece can become a bottleneck. The river is physically low. The institutions are administratively crowded, and crowded institutions move slower than falling reservoirs. That mismatch is another system pattern. The environment can change rapidly. Institutions often change through documents, meetings, public comment, litigation, budgets, engineering schedules, and political cycles. Those processes are necessary because the stakes are high. But necessity does not remove the timing problem. Water falls in real time. Rules move in procedural time. Infrastructure moves in construction time. Communities move in economic time. Climate moves in trend time. When those clocks fall out of sync, operating margin disappears. This is why reclamation's emergency actions in 2026 matter beyond the immediate year. Moving water from upstream reservoirs and reducing releases from Lake Powell are not just technical adjustments. They show that the system is already using extraordinary tools to protect critical elevations. But every protection action has trade-offs. Protecting Lake Powell can accelerate decline at Lake Mead. Lower releases can affect downstream storage. Upstream reservoir drawdowns can create regional concerns. Hydropower protection can intersect with water delivery concerns. No action is clean when the basin is this tight. That is what it means for the system to outgrow old operating rules. The old approach assumed enough separability. Water supply here, hydropower there, agriculture there, cities there, environmental flows there, treaty obligations there, but scarcity joins categories. A decision made to protect power affects water. A decision made to protect water affects power. A decision made to protect one reservoir affects another. A decision made to protect this year affects next year. A decision made to protect one group affects trust across the basin. The future will not be decided only by hydrology. It will be decided by whether institutions can handle connected risk. That is the true system pattern behind Lake Mead. A river that once allowed many conflicts to be postponed is now forcing them into the same room. A reservoir that once symbolized reserve now measures exposure. A dam that once symbolized control now reveals turbine limits. A snowpack that once symbolized recovery now has to prove it can become runoff. A legal framework that once managed shortage as a tiered exception now has to decide whether shortage is part of the baseline. This is not only a low lake, it is a future model arriving early, and the model says the next crisis may not appear as a single dramatic failure. It may appear as simultaneous constraint. A weak runoff forecast at Powell. A falling elevation at Mead. A turbine limit at Hoover. A shortage tier in the lower basin. A farm gate decision in Arizona. A conservation demand in a city. A negotiation deadline in Washington. A public trust problem across the basin. Each signal may be manageable alone. Together, they describe a new operating era. That is why the story cannot end with 1,036 feet. The number matters because it reveals the pattern, but the pattern is bigger than the number. The old question was, how low can the lake go? The new question is, how much connected pressure can the system carry while waiting for recovery? And before this story ends, one more boundary is necessary. The evidence must be separated from exaggeration. Not every problem in the Southwest is caused by one lake level. Not every forecast becomes reality. Not every low year proves a permanent collapse. But the warning does not need false certainty. The evidence is already enough. The evidence is already enough, but it has to be held carefully. That is where the story can either become useful or become noise. A low Lake Mead does not explain every water problem in the Southwest. It does not prove that every farm decision, every power cost, every conservation rule, every negotiation dispute, or every dry hillside comes from one reservoir elevation. It does not mean every forecast will become reality. It does not mean one monthly projection is destiny. It does not mean Hoover Dam is failing tomorrow. It does not mean the Colorado River is already gone. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. Here is what can be said with confidence. The Bureau of Reclamation is reporting low storage across the Colorado River reservoir system. Lake Mead and Lake Powell are both far below full capacity. The official operating studies show Lake Mead moving toward the 1,036-foot range under current projections. The runoff forecast into Lake Powell has been weak compared with average. Reclamation has already identified shortage conditions for the lower basin in 2026. Reclamation has also identified hydropower infrastructure concerns at Hoover Dam tied to lower Lake Mead elevations. Those facts are connected. They do not require a conspiracy. They do not require panic. They do not require cinematic language about the end of the Southwest. They require something harder. They require attention before the easiest image appears. The thing that is related is the chain of operating stress. Weak runoff affects Lake Powell. Lake Powell operations affect downstream conditions. Lake Mead elevation affects shortage accounting and Hoover Dam generation assumptions. Lower storage affects how much time the basin has to absorb another dry year. The post-2026 rulemaking process affects how future scarcity will be translated into decisions. That relationship is real. The thing that is only sometimes related is local weather. Rain falling near Lake Mead can matter locally, but it does not automatically refill the reservoir system. A wet month in one part of the basin does not cancel a weak mountain runoff season. A storm over the desert is not the same as a restored snow to river pathway. This is why one map can look wetter while the reservoir account remains stressed. The Colorado River does not respond to a single cloud. It responds to an entire watershed. The thing not yet proven is the exact future path. Lake Mead could shift above or below, a projection, depending on hydrology, releases, conservation, evaporation, demand, emergency operations, and policy choices. Forecasts are not fate. A future winter could improve conditions. Additional conservation could buy time. Infrastructure upgrades could reduce hydropower risk. Better rules could make shortage more orderly and fair. The system still has agency. But uncertainty is not comfort. A forecast does not have to be certain to be operationally important. If a doctor says a patient is not guaranteed to crash, but the vital signs are moving in the wrong direction, no serious person ignores the monitor. If an engineer says a bridge has not failed, but a key component is operating closer to a limit, no serious agency waits for collapse to begin inspection. If a power operator sees reserve margin shrinking before a heat event, the answer is not to wait until the lights flicker. Lake Mead is a monitor. The line on the chart is not the whole patient, but it is still a vital sign. That is the evidence boundary. Do not say the lake is empty. It is not. Do not say the dam is collapsing. It is not. Do not say every user will experience the same consequence. They will not. Do not say the next year is already known. It is not. But also do not say the system is fine because water is still visible. Do not say the problem is distant because dead pool is not tomorrow. Do not say one wet signal erases years of lost storage. Do not say record low is the only number that matters. The real risk is more specific. The real risk is operating margin. This is not just a reservoir record. This is an operating margin failure. Operating margin is the space between normal function and forced change. It is the layer of water that lets a bad forecast remain manageable. It is the reservoir cushion that lets negotiators argue without the system tightening around them. It is the hydraulic head that lets turbines run with more confidence. It is the seasonal recovery that lets farmers plant with less fear. It is the storage buffer that lets a city conserve before emergency arrives. When margin shrinks, the system does not instantly break. It becomes less forgiving. That is the part record low headlines miss. They turn the public toward a single line, as if the danger only begins when the lake crosses an old record. But the Colorado River system is already made of thresholds: shortage thresholds, power thresholds, intake thresholds, delivery thresholds, ecological thresholds, political thresholds, financial thresholds. Each one responds to the same physical decline in a different way. A record is only one threshold. It is not the whole risk. At the start of this story, the official signal arrived quietly: a Bureau of Reclamation update. A number in feet, a storage percentage, a projected year-end elevation, a runoff forecast. No siren, no dramatic aerial shot. Just a table showing that the basin's reserve time is thinner than it should be. That is how large systems often warn us. Not with a scream, with a narrowing column of numbers. The lake surface falls, and the shoreline moves. That is what the camera sees. But behind the shoreline, the operating room changes. A low forecast becomes a planning assumption. A planning assumption becomes a shortage condition. A shortage condition becomes a farm decision. A low elevation becomes a turbine concern. A turbine concern becomes a grid planning issue. A weak runoff year becomes a negotiating pressure. A negotiating pressure becomes a question of trust. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside the assumptions. The old assumption was that the Colorado River could be managed through variability because the system had enough storage and enough recovery. Dry years would hurt, but wet years would refill. Rules could be adjusted because reservoirs bought time. Infrastructure could perform because water levels would remain within expected operating bands. Cities, farms, tribes, power customers, and ecosystems would compete. But the river would still provide enough flexibility to keep the argument from becoming a crisis every season. That assumption is now being tested, not destroyed in one dramatic moment. Tested, again and again. A weak runoff forecast tests Lake Powell. A falling Lake Mead tests Hoover Dam. A shortage condition tests lower basin priorities. A farm gate tests the economic value of water. A heat wave tests the grid. A post-2026 deadline tests institutions. A public comment process with thousands of submissions tests whether the basin can still create legitimate rules under pressure. This is what a system risk looks like. Many small tests at once. The future will not be decided only by the lowest number on the Lake Mead chart. It will be decided by whether the system still has time to recover before the next load arrives. Time is the hidden resource. Time to refill. Time to negotiate. Time to replace turbines. Time to conserve without shock. Time to build infrastructure for communities that still lack reliable access to their full water rights. Time to reduce demand before physics does it violently. Time to make decisions while choice still exists. Every foot lost spends some of that time. Every weak runoff season spends more. Every delayed agreement spends more. This does not mean the future is hopeless. The Colorado River Basin still has tools. Conservation can reduce demand. Cities can reuse more water. Farms can shift practices where economics and rights allow it. Tribes can be included more fully in decision-making and infrastructure development. Power systems can plan for lower hydropower. Dams can be upgraded. Reservoir operations can adapt. Forecasting can improve. Rules can be written for reality instead of nostalgia. But tools are not the same as time. A tool used early can prevent damage. A tool used late can only distribute it. That is the final echo of 1,036 feet. The number matters not because it is the end of the story, but because it warns that the story is moving from visible decline into operating constraint. It tells us that the lake does not have to be empty to change the basin. It tells us that a reservoir can still hold water while losing the margin that made the old system feel stable. It tells us that the future may not arrive as one disaster, but as a series of decisions becoming harder, closer together, and more expensive. The lake will keep rising and falling. Some years will help. Some years will hurt. Forecasts will change. Agreements will be written. Projects will be funded. People will adapt. The Colorado River Basin is not a static victim. It is a living system of water, law, infrastructure, economy, culture, and memory. But the thing this moment reveals will remain. A system built around old assumptions is being tested by a river no longer following the old calendar. The official table at the beginning was not just a data update. It was a glimpse of that test in progress. Lake Mead, near 1,044 feet, a projection toward 1,036. Lake Powell low, system storage low, runoff weak, Hoover turbine concerns near a critical band. Post-2026 rules still taking shape. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. The headline asks whether Lake Mead could hit 1,036 feet this year. The deeper question is what will already have changed by the time it gets there. Which field will not be planted? Which turbine will be replaced too late or just in time? Which city will conserve before it has to? Which negotiation will recognize the new baseline? Which community will be asked to absorb the loss first? Which part of the system will still have margin when the next dry signal arrives? That is why record low is not the worst part. The worst part is not a number on rock. It is the possibility that the system runs out of recovery room while still appearing to function. So when the next update appears, do not look only at the lake surface. Look at the margin beneath it. Look at the runoff that did or did not arrive. Look at the rules that turn elevation into shortage. Look at the turbine head behind the dam. Look at the farm gate, the grid, the city, the treaty, and the calendar. Because the future of the Colorado River will not be decided by one dramatic day at the shoreline. It will be decided in the narrowing space between warning and response.